Hi, I'm Mark DeYmaz, and I want to welcome you to this segment of the Nines. Of course, if you're familiar with my writings or my work, you'll understand my passion for the multi-ethnic church. That is a place where men and women of diverse ethnic and economic background walk, work, and worship God together as one. And I want to spend a few moments in this segment updating you with some information that will be released in a new book I'll publish next year with Zondervan and Leadership Network. I'll give you a few things that you perhaps have not thought about or heard me speak on before. But having said that, let me just take us back for a moment to set the stage. Of course, last year's historic election for the presidency now overwhelmingly confirms that demographic shifts have brought change to America. And with this in mind, I believe that church planters and pastors can no longer afford to ignore the implications for their own lives or ministries they seek to lead. Failure to do so may soon render their work, or worse yet, their message irrelevant. And for precisely this reason, in an increasingly diverse and cynical society, people will no longer find credible the message of God's love for all people when it's preached from segregated pulpits and pews. Having said that, I'm not at all promoting or pursuing the multi-ethnic vision merely because of changing demographics, or because Tiger Woods is biracial and somehow representative of the changing face of America, nor because Rodney King once encouraged all of us to get along. Rather, it's biblical and it's right. Indeed, the New Testament church was multi-ethnic, envisioned by Christ in John 17 on the night before he died, and later described for us by Luke in the book of Acts, particularly Acts 11, where he describes the church at Antioch, and then lastly prescribed by the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians as he writes to the church there at Ephesus. And all of it, by the way, for the sake of the gospel. In other words, it's not at all about racial reconciliation. Rather, it's about reconciling men and women to God through faith in Jesus Christ. And secondly, reconciling a local congregation, a local church, to the principles and the practices of the first century church, such as existed at places such as Antioch or at Ephesus. This is the purpose of the multi-ethnic church. And indeed, in the 21st century, it may in fact become the single greatest movement of God, affecting the local church and the spread of the gospel in the next 100 years. And so with all that in mind, I want to take you on to just a few new thoughts that I think could be helpful to you as you consider these things and what it means for you and for your ministry. First of all, it's important to recognize that the multi-ethnic church as a movement is in a pioneer stage. It's a season when theology and best practices are being mined and discovered that will lead ultimately to an early adopter stage and finally to mainstream success, if you will, or the mainstream embracing these ideas. No one knows for sure when this will happen, but one of the visions that we're promoting and currently being picked up by denominations around the country is what Mosaics calls the 2020 vision. That is that 20% of churches would become 20% diverse by the year 2020. And indeed, this is a measurable goal. Now, in talking about the multi-ethnic church movement, I want you to know that I am not alone in this assessment. My good friend and sociologist Michael Emerson, author of the book Divided by Faith and also United by Faith, recently wrote in a foreword for my next book about a 10-year study that has been done on churches throughout this country. In 1997, only about 5% of Protestant churches could say that they were in fact multi-ethnic or multiracial by sociological standards. That is an 80-20 split, at least 20% diversity in the churches as studied. 10 years later, here in 2007, that number of Protestant churches that meet the 80-20 split is now 3 times higher than it was 10 years ago. And if you limit the study to evangelical Protestant churches, over 1,000 people, it's 5 times higher than it was 10 years ago. In other words, large churches are now shifting and meeting that 20% goal and going beyond that as they will in the coming years. And this will trickle down to affect all churches. So again, in speaking of the movement, there is statistical data that shows that the churches throughout America are in fact becoming increasingly diverse. Secondly, as you consider pursuing the multi-ethnic vision for yourselves and for your congregation, it's important to recognize this. The last thing that you'll want to do is split your church in the name of unity. And this you will do if you move too quickly in pursuing ideals apart from preparing the body or your staff for moving forward. And I think that the multi-ethnic church can be compared to a continuum. On the one hand, for instance, you have churches that want nothing to do with anyone who's not like them. They're not involved in foreign missions and local missions. On the other end, of course, you have the kingdom of heaven, where people from every nation, tribe, tongue worship God together as one. And all of us in our churches are somewhere in between. What's important for you is to recognize just where you're at in the pursuit of unity along this continuum, and then work to identify what is the next realistic step that your church can take to move forward in pursuing more diversity within your congregation. For instance, you should ask, what do we understand theologically, and what do we understand philosophically before attempting to make a move in a direction that would increase your diversity for the sake of the gospel? And once answering those questions, you might then say, what can we do practically? What can we do realistically as a next step? For instance, if your church is involved in foreign and local missions, you might let a 1.0 or first generation church use your facility on a Sunday afternoon. If you're already doing that, perhaps you can move to Sunday mornings and provide translation services throughout your services. Going beyond that, you would be adding staff, diverse staff to your church, and ultimately becoming fully integrated as some churches are today. So these are practical steps that you can take. And again, I encourage you to move slowly in this regard, but the important thing is to, in fact, move. And finally, one way to expedite the move to multi-ethnic churches may be through the merging of churches, particularly merging 1.0 or first-generation churches into a larger body in order to become one. In fact, our church here in Little Rock did that just over a year ago when we brought a small Hispanic church into our body and made them one with us. Specifically, this helped them because, as you know, first-generation churches often struggle with the second and third generations, but by linking with a multi-ethnic church that is not asking anyone to check their culture at the door, we've, in fact, integrated their young people into our children and our student ministries. We also added 2 pastors to our paid staff. We were able to shut down their building and save $2,500 a month, which again, we redirected to the pastors there. All in all, it's been a wonderful experience. We've added a 3rd service, increased our Hispanic population from about 8 to 18% within our body, and then also it's increased our evangelistic efforts in the Hispanic community. My friend Chris Rice at Duke University has an interesting assessment on what God is doing in and through the local church in these days in addressing the multi-ethnic church. He says this: I believe that God is not very interested in the church healing the race problem in America, but rather that God is using in these days the issue of race to heal the church. If you'd like to learn more about the multi-ethnic church or the growing movement towards multi-ethnic churches in this country, I want to encourage you to go to my blog at markdemaz.com. That's MarkDeymaz.com, where you'll find out more about it from my perspective, and also I'll connect you to the Mosaics Global Network, a growing network of like-minded pastors, educators, and practitioners, all pursuing the multi-ethnic church and speaking into one another's lives in a mutually beneficial way. Again, go to markdemaz.com for that, and I want to thank you for watching this segment and hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the day here at the Nines.